Big things are happening in the United States when it comes to climate realism. Are Canadians about to be left in the dust, or will we catch up? I'm Sheila Gunn Reid, and you're watching The Gun Show. Show you this article from the Associated Press, and you can tell it's written by the climate hysterics at the Associated Press, but just pay attention to the details they can't obscure with their hysteria. So this is from about a week ago, late July. President Donald Trump's administration on Tuesday proposed revoking a scientific finding, but it wasn't a scientific finding, as we'll get into it. It seems to be a court finding that has long been the central basis for U.S. action to regulate greenhouse gas emissions and fight climate change. The proposed Environmental Protection Agency rule would rescind a 2009 declaration that determined that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare. The endangerment finding is the legal underpinning of a host of climate regulations under the Clean Air Act for motor vehicles, power plants, and other pollution sources that are heating the planet. Repealing the finding, quote, will be the largest deregulatory action in the history of America, end quote, said EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin. He also said there are people who, in the name of climate change, are willing to bankrupt the country. They created this endangerment finding, and then they are able to put all these regulations on vehicles, on airplanes, on stationary sources to basically regulate out of existence, in many cases, a lot of segments of our economy, and it costs Americans a lot of money. I'm already jealous as a Canadian. Joining me now to break all this down for us is Tom Harris of the International Climate Science Coalition Canada in an interview we recorded earlier today. Take a listen. Joining me now is good friend of Rebel News and good friend of Reality Everywhere, Tom Harris from the International Climate Science Coalition Canada. And there's a lot of things happening in the realm of climate science. I feel like we're breaking through some of the nonsense that we've had to live with for 10 years, 8 years, 20 years, depending on how you look at it. So, Tom, I'll let you pick. What should we talk about first?
Endangerment finding in the U.S. This is really important for Canadians to understand.
Okay, start it off. Let us hear it.
Yeah, we'll have to edit out that gap.
That's okay, we will.
Yeah. The reason is that over the next few months, what's going to happen is we're going to see a lot more discussion of climate change science. And what's going to become apparent to people is things like this. This is the open letter from Richard Lindzen, MIT professor of meteorology, William Happer, professor of physics from Princeton, and Stephen Koonin, who interestingly was the person who headed up climate change research under the Obama administration. And they make some pretty definite statements. And this is going to be coming in support of the endangerment finding retraction, which we can discuss in a second. It says, in our opinion, the District Court of The Hague, which is where this letter was sent, findings that dangerous climate change and extreme weather are caused by CO2 emissions from fossil fuels are contradicted by the scientific method and only supported by the unscientific method of government opinions, consensus, peer-reviewed, and cherry-pick or falsified data. And here's where they hit the nail on the head. Science demonstrates fossil fuels and CO2 will not cause dangerous climate change. Okay, so they're very, very direct. So what we're going to see is there's going to be a lot of discussion about several things which support the retraction of the endangerment finding. But I think we have to, first of all, define what that is. What is this thing? Yeah, you know, the environmental groups have been trying for decades, literally, to get the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to control carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act. And in particular, they've been pushing for motor vehicles to be regulated based on their carbon dioxide emissions. Now, at first, the Bush administration, they just rejected this. They said, no, we don't have the mandate. We don't have the authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. But in 2007, things changed. There was a court case between various states and the EPA, and it was called EPA versus Massachusetts. And the Supreme Court decided, in their infinite wisdom, that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases were pollutants. Okay, they were pollutants, and this required, there's no choice. This required the EPA to actually determine if greenhouse gases, and in particular carbon dioxide, was this a threat to human health and welfare? And that was a very important question, because if it is, if they decided it is, then they have no choice but to regulate it. Now, the interesting thing, Sheila, is we have to realize that 80% of all the greenhouse gas emissions that are put out by humans, except for water vapor, in the United States and Canada is carbon dioxide. Okay, so carbon dioxide, 80% of the greenhouse gases that we're talking about. So really the endangerment finding was asking this question. And again, the EPA had no choice. Once the court declared that carbon dioxide and these other greenhouse gases were pollutants under the Clean Air Act, they had to conduct an assessment as to whether or not it was dangerous to humanity and the environment. And they decided that it was. Now, you can just guess that who was president at the time. It was Obama. It was the beginning of his term. So they declared that, greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, plus 3 other fluorine-type gases, that these were a threat, and the words were, to the population's health and welfare. Okay, this was the decision. And that's the foundation from which they built all of these regulations about motor vehicles, about oil and gas, about industrial processes. It's all based on the endangerment finding. Now, it's interesting that Alan Carlin, who was a chief economist at the EPA at the time, he did a really good analysis to show that there was no reason to classify carbon dioxide in particular as a pollutant. It was not a threat to health and welfare. But the EPA ignored it. In fact, you'd laugh to hear what they told him. I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember the exact words, but they essentially said, well, your findings, your report on this endangerment finding is not useful. It's not helpful because we've already decided to regulate greenhouse gases because we've already decided that they'll be harmful to human health and welfare. So, Sheila, I always turn that into a bit of a joke when I give presentations. We always talk about evidence-based decision-making. Well, what this is decision-based evidence-making.
Right.
Yeah. So they had decided that greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide, was a threat. And so they assembled all the data to support this. But of course it isn't. So the foundation of the policies that are restricting industrial development in the United States and reducing or massively increasing our price of cars and all sorts of things, this is called the endangerment finding. So what's happening now is Lee Zeldin, who's head of the EPA in the United States. Yeah, I know. You'd laugh. I love his quote. He's so candid. He's so straightforward. He said, "We are driving a dagger through the heart of the climate change religion." Which I say, hooray, hooray for you. So what's happening now is they've put out a proposal to rescind the endangerment finding, and they've published lots of material. This will undoubtedly be cited as well. But just a few days before that, they put out a report from what's called the Climate Working Group for the Department of Energy. And there were 5 scientists involved there. That actually Chris Wright, who's head of the Department of Energy, he chose these people because they were, obviously agreeing with President Trump, but also because they represented a spectrum of, expert advice. There was Ross McKittrick from Canada, which is nice. He's actually one of the authors of this report. It's about what are the real impacts of greenhouse gas emissions when you look at government data, when you look at actual science. What's the real impact? And John Christie and what's his name? It'll come back to me. But regardless, there were 5 of these scientists that I'll list later. And Coonan, he was another one from New York University. Judith Curry from Georgia Institute of Technology. Oh, yeah, and the other one is Roy Spencer. Because Spencer and Christie, they're the duo, the dynamic duo who do all the satellite measurements. So those 5 scientists put together a report, and they said some pretty interesting things. And the report is open now for public comment. What they said is, it may be that the detriments, the negative effects of these climate mitigation policies could very well be worse than any positive benefits. They also said in the report that just came out that the impact of American plans to reduce greenhouse gases will be undetectable. It'll be undetectable on global climate. And you know, it's interesting because these fellows in the report, or I should say and you know, I'll send you a copy of it so you can actually put a link on. It's actually put out, the Canadians for Sensible Climate Policy have what they call the backup book, which is in fact including this letter. But what they said is that if we go to net zero in the developed world, it will bring about mass starvation. Okay, they're very candid, and they talk about why, and it's a very detailed report. But the bottom line is that Canadians should pay attention to this for several reasons. First of all, because over the next few months, and certainly when this goes to court, because it's going to go to court, no question about it, we're going to hear a lot more from people like Richard Lindzen and Will Happer and Steve Kuhn and Ross McKittrick, all these people who are what I call climate realists. And so what's going to happen is the base of the Conservative Party, when all this climate realism is coming into the media to defend the recession of the endangerment finding, many people in the Conservative Party are going to say, well, what the heck? Why are we supporting the climate scare? Because more and more, we're going to hear that the climate scare is a mistake. It's scientifically invalid. It just doesn't work, okay? There is no threat from increasing carbon dioxide. There's only benefits. And in fact, it's interesting because in the DOE report and in this letter, they talk about the massive increase in crop productivity because of CO2, which of course is plant food. So that's number one. Because of the massive influx of climate realist science that we're going to hear over the next few years, many people are going to say to Pierre Poilievre, well, then why the heck are you supporting the climate scare? It's clearly a fake scare. You know, it's just like out of Patrick Moore's book, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Prophets of Doom. That's his book. And he talks about how in many cases, the catastrophes we're told about are invisible. We can't see them. We can't go to the north and count the polar bears. You know, we can't actually see carbon dioxide. We can't tell if there's an increase in extreme weather, which, by the way, there is not. And that was one of the conclusions from the DOE report, is that we don't see an increase in tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, droughts. None of those things are increasing in the US. So we're going to see a battle royale basically erupting in the US over this issue. And the sequence of events is this. First of all, it's open for public comment, okay? And in fact, it is right now. And then the EPA, by the end of the year, will undoubtedly bring in the final regulation. And then the lawsuits begin, okay? The environmental groups are going to sue. They're going to sue the pants off of them. And it'll go initially to the DC Court of Appeals. They go to a small group of 3 judges. And if they decide to hear it, it goes to the full panel. And no matter who wins at that point, it's almost certain to go to the Supreme Court if the Supreme Court will take it up. And I think they will. Because think about it. If the Trump administration loses at the DC Court appeal level, you know, they're going to obviously appeal it to the Supreme Court because they want to get rid of this endangerment finding. And to understand how significant it is, the endangerment finding is responsible for $1 trillion of regulation.
Yes. 31 different pieces of legislation driving up the cost of everything.
Yeah. And $54 billion a year is what they say they'll save. So Canada should pay very much attention to this. It also demonstrates you don't always have to yield to the woke left. You can fight back. So hooray for Trump doing this.
You know, as you were talking, I was thinking about the things that this would affect for Americans. And let's be clear, this endangerment regulation was their end run around doing an unpopular carbon tax. People don't like taxes in the United States, even more so than we don't like them in Canada. And so this was their way of imposing expensive regulations that would act as a tax or levy by putting these pieces of, regulation into automobile manufacturing. So this is your emissions standards that make your vehicle so super expensive and actually at the end of the day run less efficiently.
Yeah, and actually, one of the benefits of getting rid of the endangerment finding is currently with these greenhouse gas regulations, it massively increases the price of a car.
Right. And this is where I think, sorry to interrupt you, I think this is where it's really going to affect Canadians. Because if we have these emission standards still in Canada and they're making vehicles in the United States without them, they're not going to want our cars. And we're already in the midst of a trade problem.
Yeah, and Carney is going to thoroughly aggravate the situation with his carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I should just explain what that is. Carney, he campaigned on this, okay? Canadians should have known better than to vote for him when this was part of his platform. Under the carbon border, that mechanism I just spoke about, adjustment mechanism, any company in the United States that is not held to the same carbon dioxide reduction standards that we are in Canada, if they import into Canada, they have to pay a tariff based on the difference between what they had to produce it and what it would have cost to produce the same vehicle in Canada. And this would apply to all sorts of things, not just cars. So I'm sure Trump is going to be super annoyed when we put on this carbon border adjustment mechanism, because if they get rid of the EPA finding, it's going to be much cheaper to make all sorts of goods in the United States, to which Carney responds, then we'll tax the heck out of you to punish you for not doing this stupid carbon stuff.
Yeah, I mean, and even when you look at our integrated electricity grid, particularly here in Alberta, because our friends in Saskatchewan, but also our friends in Montana and Wyoming frequently bail us out when we have threatened brownouts. So we're going to be buying electricity that will be created without these onerous standards that are driving up the cost of everything. And what? So Carney's going to expect us to already buy this electricity at a premium and then put a levy on it?
Yeah, exactly. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is also going to thoroughly annoy Trump. If he isn't already annoyed enough, we're going to really annoy him.
Yeah, because, I mean, vehicles are USMCA. And so this is already covered under a trade agreement, and we can't be slapping extra tariffs on. I mean, it's just going to be really bad.
Yeah. So, the Conservative Party had better watch it, because over the next few years, and it's going to take years to get through the courts. And of course, the concern is that it may go to the Supreme Court after Trump has left his office, which I hope doesn't happen, because if it's a Democrat government, that has some sway for sure on the Supreme Court. So the hope is that all of this will be settled before the end of Trump's second term. And so it's brilliant that they're doing it right at the beginning of his term, okay? Because this is a long, long process. And the environmental groups, they're going to go ballistic. They already are about this. And, so I think in the long run, if it can be done while Trump is still president, that we will see the Supreme Court agree that, no, carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. What are you talking about? And they're going to help the EPA actually withdraw from this whole endangerment finding. That's what I hope happens.
From your lips to God's ears. Now, you just talked about the Supreme Court hopefully siding with Trump, but we have the International Court of Justice siding against humanity, really, when they say that countries, what they don't mean countries here, they mean the Western world, developed countries, have a legal duty to protect the climate and prevent harm from climate change. I thought they had a legal duty to protect people.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they're interpreting it as protecting people, but they ignored completely this letter, that I held up earlier, which was sent in 2023. I mean, November 2023. They should have read it, but they didn't. But yeah, it was a unanimous passage of this advisory, they call it. It's not binding, but it'll be used, you can be sure, by Canada and woke nations to actually back up laws that will force us to do the things they want us to do. So yeah, it's the International Court of Justice. And this started with a group of college students in Fiji, if you can imagine that. And they managed to get support from a whole lot of island nations. And then they got support from 150 plus countries in the General Assembly of the United Nations. And so it was passed a couple of years ago. They passed a resolution to ask the International Court of Justice to have a look at, does the climate crisis, as they call it, make a responsibility for developed countries to pay developing countries for the supposed damage that we're causing. And to give some sort of a perspective of what it would cost if we did what the International Court of Justice says, it turns out that the price tag for Canada would be $750 billion a year to pay for our sins. And the United States, and for the United States, it was supposed to be $5.6 trillion per year paid to developing countries to supposedly pay for our sins. And this actually goes back to the Warsaw Convention on Loss and Damage. It was trying to do the same thing. But the IJC, International Court of Justice, they're now saying that this should be used as a foundation for international discussions, negotiations, and laws, actual laws, to force us to pay for our sins. Now, the crazy thing is, we were just interviewing Ken Green from the Fraser Institute just an hour ago, and he pointed out something I think that was really important for people to realize. It's true that right now, the developed world, Canada, the United States, England, etc., is responsible for most of the CO2 from humans in the atmosphere. But the point Ken made is that China is expanding so quickly.
Right.
I mean, since the year 2000, I was looking at a graph the other day. Since the year 2000, they have multiplied their coal usage by 5, okay? A 400% increase, if you can believe that. And so I mean, by the year 2100, Ken pointed out, with China expanding so quickly, India as well, most of the greenhouse gases that are supposedly going to be causing us all this trouble, which it won't be, but most of it will be from the developing world. So exempting them from reducing their emissions, which, the Framework Convention on Climate Change does that. I mean, a lot of people say, oh, well, China has to cap its emissions at 2030, according to the Paris Agreement. And, it's funny because they know they have a sweetheart deal, because the underlying document under the Paris Agreement is the Framework Convention on Climate Change that was signed by Brian Mulroney back in 1992 in Rio. It was at the Earth Summit. And it says in Article 4, and this is the rules, and China knows this, it says the first and overriding priority of developing nations, which they still count China as developing nation, the first and overriding priority is poverty alleviation and development. So what's going to happen come 2030 is China's emissions are going to soar through the limit.
Right.
And people are going to say, oh, you're supposed to cap your emissions. And they say, nope, we've got an out clause. And you'd laugh, Sheila. They cornered the Chinese negotiator in Peru back in 2014 when they were negotiating the Paris Agreement. And they asked him, we'd like to revisit this framework convention. It doesn't quite seem fair anymore.
Right.
And the Chinese negotiator said, no, the purpose of the Paris Agreement is to enforce the framework convention. It's not to change it. So China, who are supplying us with most of the green energy stuff, which isn't really green, they're just laughing all the way to the bank. They'll be able to build coal stations across the world, throughout their country, as much as they want, sell us the green technology, which isn't really green, and they will make an absolute fortune. So, I mean, obviously, the Chinese representatives, they love this climate change.
Of course they do.
Yeah, I know.
I'd be surprised if we wouldn't be obligated to pay them something under this.
Yeah, and it's sad that Pierre Poilievre doesn't really attack this and say, look, the major supplier of EVs is China, the major supplier of wind turbines and solar panels, et cetera, et cetera. This is a make-work project, a make-profit project for China, basically. In fact, I'm just about to publish an article on this about how the West is being taken for a ride.
Yeah.
We were just in Sicily and we learned all about the mafia. Okay. And it's really pretty interesting because across Sicily, this is a bit of a side note, they put up this little sticker a few years ago. And what it says in Italian is, a people who pays protection to the mafia are a people without dignity. Well, guess what? We're paying basically the Chinese now. They're becoming our mafia in a way, you could say. And we've got to have leaders that'll stand up and say, look, of course the Chinese support the climate scare. They're making an absolute fortune. They're making a fortune, and they're not going to ever have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Right.
So, people have got to point this out. And I'm very sad that Pierre Poilievre is still supporting the scare. I think what's going to happen is over the next few years, there's going to be a revolution from within his party saying, Pierre, look at all this stuff that's coming out in the US right now because of all these court cases. you are supporting a bogus scare because, of course, Pierre Poilievre wants to have electric vehicles. He wants to have carbon dioxide stored underground, which is massively expensive. That Pathways Alliance project that we talk about in today's Financial Post, $16.5 billion, totally useless to stuff CO2 underground. That's going to add to your cost of everything that uses energy. And of course, Pierre Poilievre also wants the developing world to get off of coal. Well, no, coal is great. I mean, it's a great energy source if you have proper pollution control.
It's storable. You can just store it in a big pile.
Yeah. And, when Pierre Poilievre was running to be leader of the Conservative Party, I spoke to his campaign manager, and the implication, he wouldn't state it outright, obviously, for clear reasons, but the implication was that Pierre had to support the climate scare to become prime minister. Well, guess what? He's doubly wrong. He's doubly wrong because, of course, he didn't win, even though he was supporting the scare. And he doesn't know history, or at least he's pretending we don't know it. Stephen Harper was a very strong skeptic about the climate scare. He called the Kyoto Protocol a money-making socialist scheme, okay? And he won the election, okay? Exactly. Trump has won 2 elections in a row saying the same thing, that this is a complete hoax. So for the internal people who design communications for the Conservative Party, they're completely off base. Not only are they wrong, because there is no climate scare, there is no climate crisis, I should say, and all of these policies are just going to make our products uncompetitive, but it's not true that you have to support the climate scare to become elected. We see that over and over across the world in other places as well. So it's going to become apparent to grassroots people in the Conservative Party that their policy is totally wrong, and they better darn well change it, or they're going to stay in opposition forever.
You know what? That might be your problem going forward, and maybe not the problem of the good people of Alberta.
yeah, that's true. Maybe we'll lose you, and then, of course, we'll lose our piggy bank.
Yeah, and with us goes Saskatchewan, and I bet you parts of BC would have a serious discussion. But that is, I think, a cultural difference in this entire country, is grassroots conservatives in Alberta and Saskatchewan who work in industry, but who also work in agriculture, so who rely on the wind and the rain and the weather for their livelihood.
Yeah.
We don't believe in this stuff. and so we're pretty hard to convince that being tied to the weather god will suddenly make him not smite us anymore.
Yeah, and I'm so happy about Albertans. I lived in Cold Lake when I was in the Air Force, and I always felt I was more Albertan than I was Ontarian. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I'm very happy that Albertans are prepared to stand up and make a noise about the things that are unfair in Canada. And there's massive, massive problems. But I'm hoping that more and more Albertans will speak out, as the Americans are going to do, in support of the endangerment finding retraction. I think it's going to give I should just advertise our book.
Please.
This is a book from Canadians for Sensible Climate Policy, Energy and Climate at a Glance. Okay, and it's written by Ron Davidson from the Friends of Science, who you know very well, and Sterling Burnett, and I'm a contributing author along with Bob Lyman and a few others. But so people have got to read this because it gives you factoids, really quick facts to fight against the climate scare. And keep your eyes open, because American media are going to be forced to reveal a lot of the other side of the argument, because it's going to be a Donnybrook. For the next 4 years, we're going to see a big amount of fighting in the U.S. And happily, we're going to hear from our side for a change.
Yeah. And they're going to be treated fairly and not like crazy people for once.
Yeah.
I look forward to it. I look forward to those hearings with great anticipation. Tom, I could keep you all day, but I know you've just already completed an interview, and I've got to go into more interviews too. Tell our viewers how they can find out more about the work that you do.
Yeah, sure. Just go to the website, icsc-canada.com. Or you can check out americaoutloud.news, where we have a podcast called The Other Side of the Story. And Ken Green, who's a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute, fascinating interview we just did. That'll be up on the weekend, actually. So yeah, check out icsc-canada.com. My email address and phone number are there, and people can contact me anytime.
And how do they support your work? Because you are a tight little ship. And you're sailing against the currents of a lot of green money.
Yeah, for sure. And we don't have any government funding, unfortunately, but maybe fortunately, because then we can say, what's real.
Independent.
But yeah, we welcome donations from anybody. It's a nonprofit corporation, ICSC Canada, and there's a big red donate button up on the right-hand side of icsc-canada.com. And anything from $10 to $10,000, we're very happy, and we'll acknowledge your donation and keep you up to date as to what we're doing.
You won't waste it on high-paid McKinsey-style consultants either, I'm sure.
That's for sure.
Tom, thanks so much for coming on the show and being so generous with your time and your knowledge on these topics.
Okay, thank you, Sheila.
As always, I turn over the last segment of the show to you, because without you, there's no Rebel News. You know, we'll never take a penny from, I guess it's Mark Carney now, or any level of government to do the work that we do to hold the government to account on behalf of the people. That's who they work for. They work for you. It's my job to make sure they're doing that. Or at least when they're not, that someone is pointing it out. To afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. That's our job. And so I want to hear from you. One of the ways you can get a hold of me is by sending me an email, Sheila@rebelnews.com. Put gun show letters in the subject line so I know why you're emailing me. But also, if you are watching, I know you guys are all who are watching this right now, premium subscribers to the show. But if you are sharing the clips of the show to your friends, you know, the clips that we post on YouTube or on Rumble for free, please encourage your friends, potential new subscribers, to leave comments there. I go looking for their comments all the time, and leaving comments also does another thing. It helps push our content in front of more eyeballs. The platforms see that our content is being engaged with, and so they serve it up in front of more people, and it's the best free way to help us. And on my interview with Chris Sims about the hundreds of managers that they have over at the CBC, like managers, producers, senior, like I don't even know what all these people do. And I work in the industry, you know, just consultants and like managers, executive managers. How are those people different? And there's managers upon managers upon managers, managers for managers. No wonder it costs $1.5 billion a year over there to produce content that you don't watch. But last week's show was with my friend Chris Sims of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. They dug all this stuff up. You can watch clips of the show back on YouTube, and you can see exactly what we're talking about there. And Chris is from media also. She used to work at Sun News and CTV. And so she was sort of like, what are they even talking about? Like, if I don't know and she doesn't know, and I've been doing this job for 10 years. Why do they need all those people working at the CBC, except for the fact that they don't have to worry about efficiency or meeting a budget, because they just come to us and say, please, sir, can we have some more meaning our money? And Carney will say, heck yes, as long as you keep polishing those turds I keep laying, you got all the money you need. So let's get into some of your comments, and these are from YouTube. Max Games 9043 says, who even watches CBC? More employees than viewers. I wonder, you know, their viewership is a statistical rounding error of Canadians. And that's odd considering it is in every single home, whether you have cable, satellite, or like rabbit ears, you're getting the CBC. So for them to have that low of an audience, that's quite something. That is quite something. 700 producers producing crap. Well, that could be true, but I think we could probably fire 1 out of every 2 and you wouldn't notice a change in the CBC quality. I mean, you might not notice because like nobody watches, but I'd be willing to bet the quality didn't fall at all, right? Strife 0212 says, that's disgusting elitism. Yeah, I mean, it is. They're entitled to their entitlements, aren't they? SSPJ7BC says sunshine is the best disinfectant. Keep shining and exposing the corruption, Rebel News. Now, I'm just reporting on the good work that Chris Sims at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation did, but I think it's so important that people who are doing the work to hold the government to account on behalf of the people, especially when they work for the people and it's the people's money they're wasting. Like, government doesn't have any money. They have your money and they should be held accountable for that. Michael E3R5F says, always great work. Rebel News is the best and love the t-shirt. I think you were referring to my t-shirt in that. And it's a sweatshirt and it's from our Rebel News store. You can go to rebelnewsstore.com and the shirt is Girls Just Want to Have Guns. That's a great shirt. I actually maybe have worn it out a little bit, and that's not criticism of the quality. I just wear it all the time. Like, the cuff is starting to go a little bit, but I've washed the daylights out of it, and the logo is still great, and it's not fading or anything. So I'm actually wearing out the material itself of the shirt, while the shirt it's the construction remains the same. Remy Valois 9584 says CBC thinks they're Canada's Hollywood. People watch things produced by Hollywood, as woke as it is. I don't think people really watch things produced by the CBC. Not since Anne of Green Gables. Georgina Attridge 2957 says, this is incredible, shocking, it needs to stop. McMichael H8D says, and yet CBC is pretty much silent when it comes to fentanyl and Canada's part in this poisoning. Well, why would they be critical of the government that is funding all these managers' jobs? Right? And Peter Batista 1095 says, and the most disgusting thing about this, if you ask them, is that they will try to justify those exorbitant wages. Such elitist arrogance. They should be forced to work in the public sector for a year or two. I think you mean the private sector, so they can see public sector being government. I think you mean with the public in the private sector. Yeah, because they would have to meet performance targets and they wouldn't get to watch a yoga video at their desk every day and then talk to a consultant about whatever diversity nonsense they need to talk about and then go talk to their feelings with their union rep and things like that. So yeah, they'd be in for a real rude awakening. Well, everybody, that's the show for tonight. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see everybody back here in the same time, in the same place next week. And as always, don't let the government tell you that you've had too much to think.